Listen closely, honestly. Trump's grip on the GOP is no longer contested in any meaningful sense. What looks like tension is, post-defeat noise, the kind of public friction that survives after the real decision has already been made. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand something that the mainstream conversation keeps missing. The party did not remain divided over Trump. It adapted around him. Here's the central fact. Trump turned personal loyalty into an operating system. Actually, he did not merely win primaries and endorsements. He rewired the incentive structure inside the Republican Party so that survival depended on visible submission, not institutional standing, not donor approval, not committee seniority, and not ideological pedigree. Once that happened, every supposed rival had to answer the same question: are you useful to Trump, or are you disposable? That is not a temporary feud. That is regime architecture. Watch how the old Republican gatekeepers broke in sequence. First, the donors discovered that money without rank and file control did not buy them much. Well, then the establishment learned that cable exposure and think tank respectability did not stop primary voters from choosing Trump's preferred line. Then the elected officials themselves learned the hard way that crossing him did not create a counter-coalition. It created a career problem. One by one, the actors who used to enforce discipline stopped being enforcers and became adapters. That is why the supposed civil war keeps producing the same result. Trump's critics retreat and his allies move one step closer to the center of the party's machinery. The arithmetic is brutal. A party is not controlled by its loudest dissidents. It is controlled by the side that can decide who gets nominated, who gets funding, who gets committee protection, and who gets punished in a primary. Trump dominates all four channels. In 2024, his endorsement remained the most efficient signal in Republican politics because it told candidates exactly where the base, the media ecosystem, and the donor class had already begun to drift. A candidate who needs a statewide electorate, a national fundraising network, and a future in the party does not gamble against that reality unless he wants to end his career early. Rebellion is not heroic when the arithmetic is this lopsided. It is irrational. Look at the collapse in polling and electoral behavior. Republican voters did not just prefer Trump by a margin. They built their identities around his conflict style, his revenge politics, and his promise to punish the institutions they already distrust. That makes anti-Trump positioning expensive inside the party. It narrows the audience to a shrinking group of highly engaged voters who are loud in elite circles and weak in nomination contests. The people most eager to declare independence from Trump are usually the same people with the least leverage over the actual machinery of Republican politics. That is why they lose. The base is not waiting for liberation. The base has already chosen its ruler. What does that mean in practice? It means policy now bends toward Trump's preferences, not toward the old party orthodoxies. Immigration becomes a test of loyalty. Trade becomes a performance of protection. Foreign policy becomes a loyalty filter for voters who want confrontation, not caution. Even on judges, tax policy, and executive power, the party has internalized Trump's method: loyalty first, institution second, principle only when it is useful. This is how a political movement becomes reorganized around one man without formally admitting it. The vocabulary changes before the statutes do. Most people stop here, and that is exactly why they miss what I am about to explain next. The real story is not just that Trump dominates the GOP. The real story is that the party built new survival rules around the fact of his dominance. Candidates now calculate whether distance from Trump helps them in a general election, but they know that visible disloyalty can end their nomination before the general election even begins. Donors do the same calculation. Consultants do the same calculation. Legislators do the same calculation. Once everyone is optimizing for the same gravitational center, the conflict is already over. It just has not been formally announced. So no, the GOP is not split in two anymore. It has been reorganized around one man. The factions that once claimed to resist him have been reduced to commentary, not control. To see why this happened so fast, You have to look at what Trump did to the party's internal architecture. The real turning point was not a speech or a primary night, but the collapse of every structural barrier that once limited him. That is where the old guard began to fail, not in public speeches, but in the quiet loss of leverage. Once the institutions could not punish dissent, they could only adapt to it. And that was the real turning point, because Trump did not merely survive the party's internal resistance. He converted loyalty to himself into the only governing principle that still worked inside the Republican system. He understood something the traditional leadership never fully grasped. Power in a party is not just access to donors, committee chairs, and television clips. Power is the ability to decide who gets protected, who gets isolated, and who gets forced out. Trump took that logic and rebuilt it around personal allegiance. If you backed him, you could be elevated overnight. If you opposed him, the old institutions would no longer save you. Congressional leaders could criticize him, but they could not reliably discipline their own members if those members believed Trump's endorsement mattered more than the whip count. That is not a personality cult in the casual sense. That is a replacement system. The first collapse happened inside Congress. The old Republican leadership model depended on deference, committee structure, and the assumption that senior figures could still define the party's boundaries. Trump shredded that assumption. He did not need to control every vote. He only needed to make disobedience more dangerous than obedience. Members learned the lesson quickly. A public break with Trump could trigger a primary threat, a fundraising penalty, hostile coverage from the right-wing ecosystem, and a long-term stigma with the base. A quiet accommodation brought the opposite: airtime, donor access, and survival. Once that pattern became visible, the leadership class lost its enforcement power. They could plead, they could bargain, they could not compel. The donor class followed the same logic. Some tried to wait him out. Some pretended the party could return to its pre-Trump order once the cycle passed. That calculation failed because money is not just money in politics, it is signaling. When large donors, industry groups, and networked fundraisers realized that their preferred alternatives could not command the base, their leverage evaporated. They could fund candidates, but they could not manufacture legitimacy. They could finance a challenge, but they could not guarantee that challenge would live past the first primary. The result was predictable. The donor class stopped being a disciplining force and became a rent-paying class, allocating resources to the faction most likely to survive. The conservative institutions that once policed the party were hit even harder. Think tanks, legal networks, magazines, advocacy groups, and elite media figures all tried some version of controlled resistance. They criticized Trump when it was safe. They negotiated with him when it was not. They waited for a moment when the base would tire of him. But the base did not behave like an elite audience. It behaved like a constituency that had fused identity with defiance. Once that happened, the gatekeepers no longer controlled the gate. They could still write arguments. They could not enforce consequences. That is the difference between commentary and power. This is why so many establishment personalities failed. They thought time was on their side. It was not. They thought scandal would exhaust him. It did not. They thought policy failures would separate him from his voters. They did not. The polling and electoral math made rebellion irrational. In state after state, Trump's hold on Republican primary voters remained strong enough to turn opposition into self-destruction. A politician who crossed him could still be admired in Washington and still be finished at home. That is the arithmetic that destroyed the old guard. Once that became obvious, neutrality was interpreted as weakness and dissent as treason. The consequence is larger than one man's popularity. Policy now flows through loyalty tests. Candidate survival depends on prior accommodation. The future of the party is no longer decided by a balance between factions. It is decided by the degree to which each figure can demonstrate alignment without losing credibility elsewhere. That is why so many Republicans moved from resistance to submission without any genuine conversion. They were not persuaded, they were outmatched. The old guard did not simply lose an argument. It lost enforcement power. It no longer had a mechanism capable of compelling party unity against Trump. That is the larger lesson, The GOP is not split in two anymore. It has been reorganized around one man because every rival center of authority was tested and found unable to impose a cost. The leadership could not discipline him. The donors could not isolate him. The institutions could not contain him. And once that became clear, the rest was administration of defeat. But institutional collapse alone does not explain the speed of the surrender. The deeper answer is that the numbers punished resistance and rewarded alignment, turning a political dispute into a survival calculation. And once the numbers start pointing the same way, ideology becomes secondary to survival. People do not stay in losing fights when the scoreboard keeps moving against them. They adjust. They fold. They tell themselves it was principle, but the arithmetic is what moves them. Trump understood that early. He did not merely win elections. He turned personal loyalty into a governing system inside the party where access, endorsement, fundraising, and media relevance all flowed through him or were denied by him. That is how a faction becomes a structure. Once senators, governors, and primary hopefuls learned that a public break invited retaliation and a public embrace unlocked the base, the old Republican hierarchy stopped functioning as a genuine counterweight. The rival factions did not disappear because they were defeated in some abstract ideological debate. They collapsed because they could not protect their own incumbents, and they could not raise the cost of defiance enough to make rebellion sustainable. The donor class read the same reality first. Money is not sentimental. When major contributors see that a candidate cannot survive a primary without the blessing of the dominant figure, they stop financing resistance and start financing adaptation. That is what happened. The institutional gatekeepers who once expected to discipline the party discovered they were now reacting to it. Editorial boards lost leverage. National committees lost leverage. Committee chairmen lost leverage. The people who had once assumed that the party could be managed from the top found themselves negotiating with the bottom because the bottom belonged to Trump. The polling made the trap visible. In state after state, primary voters signaled that loyalty to Trump was not a side issue but the central test. Candidates who tried to build a case against him often discovered that they were not just competing with a rival politician, they were competing with a social identity, and social identities are expensive to challenge. If Trump's approval inside the Republican coalition sits in the high 70s or low 80s, then a senator who attacks him is not making a clean policy argument. He is volunteering for a hostile electorate in the very place where his future is decided. If a primary electorate is 55% or 60% aligned with Trump and the anti-Trump share is split among several candidates, then rebellion is not courage. It is a donation to your own defeat. Turnout patterns sharpen the lesson. The voters most animated by Trump are also the ones most likely to appear in low information, low turnout primaries, which means they carry disproportionate power inside the nomination process. That is why so many elected Republicans who privately dislike him still behave as if they are trapped by him they are. The median general election voter matters less in a primary than the most engaged factional voter, and Trump owns that space. The result is that candidates and senators look at the same polling crosstabs, the same turnout models, the same donor signals, and reach the same conclusion. Opposing Trump costs more than accommodating him. That calculation reshapes policy. It changes what gets defended, what gets ignored, and what gets quietly dropped. Immigration becomes harder line because the base demands it. Trade becomes more nationalist because Trump made that language politically mandatory. Foreign policy hawks learn to speak in the vocabulary of strength without actually challenging him. Even when the policy content shifts only marginally, the personnel changes are real. Ambition filters itself. The people who could once imagine a post-Trump GOP now have to ask whether they are building a career, a protest, or a slow-motion exit. This is why the party's future is not a clean split between two equal camps. It has been reorganized around one man. The old Republican Party still exists in memory, in donor meetings, and in a few edited talking points, but operationally, the system now rewards conformity and punishes deviation. The anti-Trump rebellion looks irrational because, under current conditions, it is irrational. The numbers do not reward martyrdom. They reward alignment, hesitation, and selective silence. That logic reshapes everything downstream, because the people who once sold themselves as alternatives now have to decide whether to resist, retreat, or recast themselves as loyalists. And once that decision is made, it does not just determine who survives the next primary. It determines what the party is becoming. From there, the system becomes self-reinforcing. If loyalty is what gets rewarded, then everyone starts producing loyalty on demand. The result is not merely discipline. It is a political market in which access, protection, and advancement all flow through one man. Trump did something the old party structure never fully understood until it was too late. He turned personal allegiance into a governing standard, not agreement on tax policy, not a consistent conservative philosophy, not even competence. The real test became simple. Will you defend him when it matters, repeat his claims when necessary, and absorb the costs of standing near him? Once that rule took hold, the rest of the party began to adapt around it. Candidates learned to signal devotion early because hesitation read as weakness and weakness invited elimination. Office holders calibrated every public statement to avoid crossing the line from acceptable independence into disloyalty. Even disagreement had to be packaged as reverence. That changes the incentive structure completely. Under a normal party, donors fund ideology, committees reward organization, and elected officials protect a platform. Under the Trump system, those channels still exist, but they are subordinate to proximity. A fundraiser who can get a photo, a mention, or a nod from Trump becomes more valuable than a fundraiser who understands district math. A media figure who can claim special access becomes more relevant than one who can explain legislation. A candidate who can demonstrate public submission gets a faster path than one with stronger credentials. The currency is not principle. The currency is closeness. And once that starts, rival factions collapse in place. The old gatekeepers lose leverage because their authority no longer determines survival. Traditional conservative institutions can complain, but they cannot confer immunity. Donors who once imagined they could shape the party through checks and private meetings discover that they are now reacting to a leader who can bless one rival and erase another overnight. The institutional middle, the people who used to mediate disputes and manage succession, are bypassed. They are not defeated in a dramatic purge. They are made irrelevant by repetition. The polling and electoral math make rebellion irrational. That is the part many observers miss. If a politician believes Trump still commands the base, then crossing him is not an act of courage. It is career suicide. Primary voters in many districts and states remain responsive to Trump's signals, and that means the safest move is usually to mirror his language, adopt his frame, and avoid any public distance that could be clipped, replayed, and weaponized. Even where the broader electorate is more complicated, the immediate threat is not the general election. It is the primary. And in a party where the primary is the real battlefield, loyalty becomes the most efficient survival strategy. So policy follows the leader. Immigration, trade, judicial selection, foreign policy, even language about allies and enemies are all filtered through one central question. Does this reinforce Trump's hold on the party coalition? Candidates do not ask what is most coherent over time. They ask what signals belonging now. Office holders do not ask what preserves institutional credibility. They ask what avoids becoming the next example. Media figures and fundraisers do not ask what strengthens the party as a whole. They ask what keeps them inside the circle of relevance. That is why the Republican Party is no longer best understood as a party split in two. That was the early misunderstanding. The real transformation is deeper. It has been reorganized around one man. The older factions have not vanished, but they no longer set the terms. They orbit the center that Trump created, and they do so because the rewards of proximity are immediate while the costs of resistance are severe. In that environment, principle becomes ornamental, consistency becomes optional, loyalty becomes the main credential. Once loyalty hardens into the new currency, the next question is what happens to policy. The answer is that policy stops leading the party and starts following the leader. Once power decides the menu, policy debate becomes a selection process, not a search for first principles. The arguments that survive are the ones that fit the coalition Trump built. That is the real structure of the modern Republican Party, not a pluralist institution competing over doctrine, but a hierarchy organized around personal dominance. Trump did not merely win the party, he converted loyalty into a governing system. Inside the GOP, advancement now depends less on administrative competence or ideological pedigree than on whether a candidate, donor, or office holder is seen as safe in relation to him. That changes everything. A politician can be wrong on the substance and still survive if he is useful in maintaining the coalition. He can be inconsistent, even openly theatrical, and still remain viable if he reinforces the basic emotional contract with the base. The old Republican gatekeepers used to filter for donors, committee chairs, editorial approval, and institutional respectability. Trump broke that chain. He made the audience itself the gatekeeper, and once that happened, the party's internal logic changed from coalition management to loyalty verification. That is why the rival factions collapsed so quickly. The movement conservatives who once claimed the party through ideas were forced to choose between influence and irrelevance. The business wing discovered that access depended on accommodation. The foreign policy establishment learned that credentials no longer guaranteed deference. Even the donor class, which imagined it could finance a return to normal, found that money without alignment could not command obedience. Trump's power inside the GOP is not only electoral, it is disciplinary. It teaches every ambitious Republican the same lesson. The cost of visible dissent is higher than the cost of adaptation. The polling and electoral math make rebellion irrational. In state after state, Republican candidates have seen that the path to nomination runs through the Trump-aligned primary voter, not through the approval of donor networks or cable news editors. When Trump endorses, he changes the temperature of a race. When he turns against someone, he changes the incentives for everyone watching. That is not ideology, that is survival arithmetic. A candidate may privately disagree with Trump on trade, immigration, fiscal policy, or even foreign entanglements. But if the primary electorate identifies those disagreements as betrayal, then dissent becomes career suicide. The smart move is not to resist the dominant coalition. It is to signal within it. The game continues.